Imagine an empire, one that covered 3 continents, one that stood for more than 6 centuries. This was one of the strongest empires in Islamic history, the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, it stood as the greatest military and political power of the Muslim world. It carried Islamic rule deep into Europe, conquered Istanbul, defeated Crusader armies, and challenged the most powerful states on earth. But the story of this great empire did not begin in magnificent palaces or among vast armies. It began at the end of the 13th century, during one of the darkest periods in the history of the Islamic world. The Mongols destroyed the Muslim world. During this difficult time, the Turks rose and helped rebuild the Islamic world. In this documentary, we will explore the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire. Even today, you can still see its legacy in more than 40 countries. You're watching Religious Story TV. If you enjoy documentaries like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. If you're ready, let's begin. Towards the end of the 13th century, the world was quietly changing. The strongest Muslim states were collapsing one by one, first because of the Crusades and then under the Mongol invasion. Baghdad had been burned, the Caliphate had been destroyed, great cities were reduced to ashes. For Muslims, it felt like the end of the world. The Mongols, through the conquests started by Genghis Khan, had turned the Islamic world upside down. Even after his death, the Mongol armies did not stop. They destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate and also ended the Seljuk Empire, the sword of Islam, led by the Turks. And right in the middle of this chaos, in a tiny place that almost nobody could even find on a map, something strange was happening. On the western edge of Anatolia, right next to the Byzantine Empire, there was a small group of a few hundred Turkmen tents. Their leader was a young chief named Osman. He had no great army and no great treasury. He had only one thing: faith. Nobody knew that this man was about to lay the first stone of one of the longest-lasting states in history. And everything would begin with a dream seen at night. According to the narration, one night Osman Bey stayed as a guest in the house of Sheikh Edebali. Because there was a copy of the Quran in the room, he did not think it was respectful to lie down and sleep. Instead, he spent the whole night sitting. That night, he saw the most famous dream of his life. A moon rose from the chest of Sheikh Edebali and entered the chest of Osman Bey. Then, a huge plane tree began to grow from Osman Bey's body. Its branches stretched across 3 continents. It crossed mountains. It cast its shadow over rivers. People found peace under the shade of that tree. This dream became one of the most famous symbols in Ottoman history, not to gain power, but to bring order to the Islamic world and the West, not to destroy, but to keep people alive through a state. Just as Sheikh Edebali is reported to have said to Osman Bey, "Keep people alive so that the state may live." Osman Bey's greatest success was not only winning battles, it was earning the trust of the people. The year was 1299. At one of the hardest moments in Islamic history, Osman Bey declared the foundation of the Ottoman state. But declaring independence is easy. Staying alive is much harder. In front of him stood the great Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, tired but still powerful. The Ottoman principality was the smallest Muslim state, perhaps also the poorest and the weakest compared to the others. Its army was small, its treasury was limited. It had no great cities, it did not even have access to the sea. For this reason, Osman Bey started with small raids. After every victory, more warriors joined him. As his name spread, people began to call him a Ghazi, a hero who fought for his faith. So what made this man different from the other rulers? Simple. He was never in a hurry. While the other Turkish principalities fought and competed with one another, he focused only on the West, against the Byzantine Empire. He was a hero who fought for his religion. He could not fight against his Muslim brothers. He succeeded in bringing together different Turkmen tribes. In time, even some Byzantine soldiers and local governors chose to serve under Osman. Because the people living on the frontier were not only looking for a strong warrior, they were looking for justice, they were looking for safety, they were looking for a future where their children could live. And that was exactly what Osman Bey promised: Islamic justice and an Islamic way of life. The state that would rule 3 continents for nearly 6 centuries, conquer Constantinople, take over the Caliphate, and shape world politics for centuries, was born in this humble frontier town and built upon Islamic justice. For this reason, the Ottoman Empire continues to be remembered as one of the 3 greatest empires in history. The state founded by Osman would change not only the destiny of Anatolia, but the destiny of the entire world. In another famous story about Osman Bey, he is said to have met Rumi when he was still very young. According to the narration, young Osman was sent by his father, Ertugrul Ghazi, to deliver an important message to the Seljuk Sultan Alauddin Keykubat. On the palace stairs, he met Rumi. Impressed by the young man's respectful manners, Rumi asked, "My son, who are you?" Osman replied, "I am Osman, the son of Ertugrul Ghazi, one of the frontier rulers." Rumi looked at the young Osman and said, "The Seljuk Sultan has found himself a sheikh, and I have accepted you as my son." He then took Osman with him to the Mawlawi lodge. At the lodge, Osman was dressed in Mawlawi clothes. Rumi said to him, "My son, recite Surat al-Fatiha." While Osman recited al-Fatiha with prayer beads in his hand, Rumi closed his eyes and entered a deep spiritual state. When he opened his eyes again, he asked, "How many times did you recite al-Fatiha?" Osman answered, "I recited it 18 times. Rumi replied, "I also recited it 18 times. Together they make 36. I have taken the Islamic Sultanate from the Seljuks and given it to you. May it be blessed. From your family, 36 sultans will come." After hearing this good news, Osman Bey is said to have remained firmly devoted to the Islamic cause of Gaza. Years later, the cities of the Byzantine Empire began to fall under Ottoman rule one by one. These victories were not only military successes. Every new city meant that the state became stronger. The conquered people were treated with justice. Production and trade continued without interruption. The local Greek population was treated well, and no religious pressure was forced upon them. Because of this justice, many Greek villages and towns, together with their local leaders, willingly joined the Ottoman side. The principality was now becoming a true state. But one great obstacle still stood before it: Bursa, one of the strongest Byzantine cities in the region. It was surrounded by high walls. It was rich. It was crowded. And it did not look like a city that would surrender easily. Osman Bey knew that capturing Bursa would not be an ordinary conquest. If Bursa fell, nothing would ever be the same again. The Ottomans would enter the path of becoming a true state. But fate had one final surprise. Osman Bey would never live to see the conquest of the city to which he had devoted so much of his life. When the gates of Bursa finally opened, the man carrying the Ottoman banner was no longer Osman Bey. It was his son, Orhan Bey, and that was the day the true rise of the Ottoman Empire began. After years of siege by his father, Bursa was finally conquered by Orhan Gazi in 1326. The conquest of Bursa was far more than the capture of another city. It was one of the richest Byzantine trading centers in Anatolia. More importantly, the Ottomans now had a true capital. The nomadic tents slowly gave way to stone buildings. State affairs were organized more efficiently. Judges were appointed, madrasas were established, and the city developed rapidly. But Orhan Gazi was not satisfied with conquering cities alone. He began introducing major reforms that would shape the future of the Ottoman state. During his father's time, the army had mostly consisted of volunteer warriors. They gathered during wartime and returned to their normal lives once the campaign ended. Orhan Gazi began creating permanent units of salaried soldiers. Soon after came another important reform. The first Ottoman coins were minted. Under Orhan Gazi's rule, the Ottoman state continued to expand rapidly. Nicaea was conquered. This city held enormous importance for the Christian world. It was here that the famous First Council of Nicaea was held in 325 AD. For centuries, it had been one of the Byzantine Empire's most important religious and cultural centers. A few years later, most of the eastern coast of the Sea of Marmara had come under Ottoman control. Meanwhile, Constantinople was becoming increasingly isolated. Inside the Byzantine Empire, struggles for the throne had broken out once again. As rival claimants fought each other, they searched for outside allies. One of them asked Orhan Gazi for military support. In return, he offered valuable concessions. This decision would change the course of Ottoman history. For the first time, Ottoman soldiers officially set foot in Europe. At first, it seemed to be nothing more than military assistance. No one realized that it was the first step toward an Ottoman presence in Europe that would last for centuries. In 1352, Ottoman forces captured the fortress of Simpe. The fortress itself was small, but its importance was enormous. The Ottomans now had a permanent base on the European continent. 2 years later, nature changed everything. A powerful earthquake destroyed the Byzantine walls around Gallipoli. Much of the city's population fled the region. Orhan Gazi did not waste the opportunity. Ottoman forces occupied Gallipoli. Soon afterward, Turkmen families from Anatolia were settled there. The Ottomans were no longer just an army fighting in Europe. They were becoming a state that was settling there permanently. The Byzantine Empire realized its mistake far too late. At first, it had viewed the Ottomans as a temporary ally that could be used in its civil wars. But once the Ottomans crossed into Europe, they had no intention of ever leaving. From that moment on, the Balkans became their next great objective. And across Europe, kingdoms slowly began to notice the rise of this new power from the east. No one yet understood how great a challenge it would become. Now, a new ruler was about to enter the stage. A ruler who would shake the Balkans and transform the Ottoman state into a true empire. Murad. When Murad I ascended the throne in 1362, he inherited a strong and growing state. But he knew that keeping a growing state alive was much harder than building one. There were still rival Turkish principalities in Anatolia. Although the Byzantine Empire had grown much weaker, it had not yet fallen. In the Balkans, the Serbs, Bulgarians, Hungarians, and many smaller principalities watched the Ottoman advance into Europe with increasing concern. Murad decided to focus on Europe first, because Byzantium was no longer the greatest threat. The real struggle would begin in the Balkans. The Ottoman armies soon advanced deeper into Thrace. In the mid-1360s, Adrianople, today's Edirne, was conquered. Edirne was a strategic city where the major Balkan routes met. Whoever controlled it could keep Constantinople under pressure while advancing deeper into the Balkans. Murad made an important decision. He moved the capital from Bursa to Edirne. This decision changed the future of the Ottoman state. From that moment on, the center of power gradually shifted from Anatolia to Europe. Most future Ottoman conquests would take place in the Balkans, But Murad was not only a ruler who conquered cities, he also wanted to strengthen the state from within. To achieve this, he introduced further military reforms. The permanent army system established during his father's reign was expanded and improved. At regular intervals, boys were selected from Christian families in the Balkans and educated by the state. They learned Islam, spoke Turkish, and received military and administrative training. The most successful students could rise all the way to the Enderun school inside the imperial palace, eventually becoming grand viziers and holding the highest offices of the state. This system became one of the most important institutions that strengthened the Ottoman central government for centuries. While Murad continued his reforms, the Balkan kingdoms were not standing still. The Ottoman state grew stronger every year, forcing the rulers of the region to unite. Serbian princes, Bulgarian nobles, and other Christian powers formed an alliance to stop the advance of the Muslim Ottomans. In 1371, the two armies met near the Maritsa River. Known in European sources as the Battle of Maritsa, this became one of the first great turning points in Ottoman history. The larger Balkan army underestimated the Ottoman forces, but a surprise Ottoman attack during the night completely destroyed their plans. The battle quickly turned into a complete disaster for the Balkan alliance. Thousands of soldiers were either killed in battle or drowned while trying to escape across the river. After this victory, many Balkan principalities were forced to recognize Ottoman supremacy. Some agreed to pay tribute. Others began sending soldiers to serve in the Ottoman army. Some remained officially independent, but were now under Ottoman influence. Murad was not only expanding through conquest, he was also building a smart system of government. Many rulers who surrendered were allowed to remain in power. In return, they pledged loyalty and paid tribute. Thanks to this policy, the Ottomans were able to govern vast territories with far fewer rebellions. But the rise of the Ottoman state was creating growing fear across Europe. This was no longer just about a few border fortresses. A new power had emerged, and every year it became stronger. By 1389, the Balkan kingdoms decided to unite one final time. Led by the Serbian Prince Lazar, they formed a great alliance. Their goal was clear: to drive the Muslim Ottomans completely out of the Balkans. The two armies met on the plain of Kosovo. This battle would become one of the greatest turning points, not only in Ottoman history, but in the history of the entire Balkans. The fighting lasted for hours. Both sides suffered heavy losses. In the end, the Ottoman army was victorious, but the price of victory was extremely high. After the battle, while inspecting the battlefield, Murad was stabbed and killed by a Serbian nobleman traditionally identified as Milos Obilic. Thus, Murad I became the first and only Ottoman Sultan to die on the battlefield. The victory at Kosovo firmly established Ottoman dominance over the Balkans. Europe no longer saw the Ottomans as a temporary frontier state. This rising power from the east had become strong enough to change the future of the continent. While Murad's body was being taken to Bursa, an urgent decision was made on the battlefield. The army could not remain without a leader. The commanders acted immediately. The throne was handed to Murad's son right there on the battlefield. The new sultan was Bayezid I, better known as Yildirim Bayezid, meaning Bayezid the Thunderbolt. No one knew that within just a few years he would transform the Ottoman state into one of the most powerful powers in history. Nor did anyone know that during his own reign, the state would come closer than ever before to complete destruction. After Murad I, who defeated the Crusader army in Kosovo and was martyred there, Yildirim Bayezid ascended the throne. The new ruler had a very different personality from his father. Rather than being a patient statesman, Bayezid was a commander who moved with incredible speed. He marched his armies so quickly that his enemies often had no time to react. That is why history gave him the title Yildirim, meaning the Thunderbolt. As soon as he became sultan, he turned his attention to the Balkans. After the victory at Kosovo, several Serbian princes accepted Ottoman rule. Some agreed to pay tribute, while others began sending troops to serve in the Ottoman army. But Bayezid did not rely on military power alone. Through marriages, diplomacy, and the vassal system, he steadily expanded Ottoman influence across the region. As Ottoman control over the Balkans became stronger each year, he turned his attention back to Anatolia. His goal was to unite the many Turkish principalities into a single Muslim Turkish state. One by one, Bayezid brought them under Ottoman rule, some by war, some through agreements, others through political pressure. Within only a few years, most of Anatolia had become part of the Ottoman state. Not everyone in Anatolia welcomed these changes. Believing that he had largely united the Turkish lands, Bayezid turned his eyes once again toward Constantinople. He hoped to conquer the city and become the commander mentioned in the famous hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Constantinople will surely be conquered. What a wonderful commander its commander will be, and what a wonderful army that army will be. By this time, the Byzantine Empire was almost completely surrounded by Ottoman territory. The city still stood, but it was struggling to survive. In 1394, Bayezid began the siege of Constantinople. This was not a short campaign. It was a long blockade that lasted for years. The city's land connections were largely cut off. The Byzantine Emperor Manuel appealed to Europe for help. He knew he could not survive alone, and Europe answered. At the Pope's call, France, Hungary, the German principalities, the Knights of Burgundy, and many other Christian states formed a new Crusader army. Their goal was clear: to stop the Muslim advance in Europe and drive the Muslims out of the continent. In 1396, the two armies met near Nicopolis on the banks of the Danube. The Crusader army greatly outnumbered the Ottomans. It also included many of Europe's finest knights. Many commanders were so confident of victory that they were already discussing how to divide the spoils before the battle had even begun. But Bayezid watched them carefully. The Crusader army had lost its discipline. The heavily armored knights, underestimating the Ottoman army, launched an early attack. It was exactly what Bayezid had been waiting for. The Ottoman front lines deliberately fell back. As the knights continued advancing, they became exhausted. Their formations broke apart. At that very moment, Ottoman cavalry attacked from both flanks. Fresh Ottoman forces then entered the battle from the rear. Within only a few hours, the entire battle had turned around. The Crusader army collapsed. Thousands of soldiers were killed. Many European nobles were taken prisoner. Some were released after paying large ransoms. Others were executed. The victory at Nicopolis shocked all of Europe. The Ottoman state was no longer just a Balkan power. It had become a force that all of Europe was talking about. After this victory, Bayezid began to believe that no earthly power could stop him. But in the east, a far greater storm was approaching. His name was Timur. Rising from Samarkand, this powerful ruler had conquered much of Central Asia, Persia, Afghanistan, and Mesopotamia. Like Bayezid, he never stopped conquering. A clash between these two great rulers had become inevitable. At first, they exchanged only letters, but these letters were far from friendly. Timur openly insulted and looked down on Yildirim Bayezid. Bayezid answered him with equal determination. Both believed that they were the strongest ruler in the Islamic world. There was, however, one important difference. Bayezid was fighting against Europe and defeating the Crusader armies. Timur, on the other hand, spent much of his campaigns fighting other Muslims. For many Muslim scholars, the difference was clear. Many Islamic scholars criticized Timur for treating Muslims much as the Mongols had done before him and for killing large numbers of Muslims. Several Anatolian rulers whose lands had been absorbed by Bayezid fled to Timur. Timur demanded that their territories be returned. Bayezid firmly refused. Diplomacy had come to an end. In 1402, the two great armies met near Ankara. Perhaps the most critical battle in Ottoman history was about to begin. Bayezid's army was powerful. The Janissaries were experienced veterans, but Timur's army was even larger. It even included war elephants. When the battle began, the Ottoman army held its ground during the first hours. Then something unexpected happened. Some of the Anatolian troops fighting for the Ottomans changed sides. These soldiers came from former principalities whose lands had been taken by the Ottomans. Their defection changed the course of the battle. The intense summer heat, lack of water, and long marches had already exhausted the Ottoman army. Now, its entire formation was falling apart. Timur used his experienced cavalry to surround the Ottoman center. Bayezid continued fighting until the very end, but he was eventually captured. This was not only the defeat of a ruler, the entire Ottoman state was shaken. The conquests that had advanced across Europe like lightning came to a sudden stop because of Timur. Even worse, the Ottoman state no longer had a ruling sultan. The old Anatolian principalities began declaring their independence once again. The Balkans fell into uncertainty. The Ottoman princes no longer trusted one another, and everyone began asking the same question: was this the end of the Ottoman state? Throughout history, many great empires had disappeared after a single major defeat. Would the Ottoman state suffer the same fate? Or would it somehow rise again from its ashes? Many people believed that the Ottoman state had finally come to an end. History had seen this happen many times before. A great ruler dies. The central government collapses. The princes begin fighting one another. Neighboring states invade, and the empire disappears from history. The Ottoman state now seemed to be at exactly that point. For the first time in many years, the Byzantine Empire could finally breathe again, thanks to Timur, who called himself a Muslim and claimed to fight for Islam. Yet instead of restoring stability after destroying the Ottoman state, Timur simply returned to his own lands. His campaign had brought destruction rather than lasting order. Meanwhile, each of Bayezid's sons claimed the throne for himself. Each declared that he was the rightful ruler. Suleiman took control of the European territories. He chose Edirne as his capital. He made agreements with Byzantium and formed alliances with several Balkan rulers. He believed that he was the legitimate ruler of the Ottoman state. Meanwhile, in eastern Anatolia, Mehmed II was quietly gathering strength. His center of power was Amasya. He appeared calm, but he was extremely patient. While his brothers fought one another, he carefully increased his own power. Thus began one of the darkest periods in Ottoman history. Today, this period is known as the Ottoman Interregnum. For nearly 11 years, the Ottoman state had no single ruler. This was more than a struggle for the throne. It was a fight for the survival of the state itself. The first clashes began quickly. After many battles, Mehmed finally emerged victorious. With that, the 11-year interregnum came to an end. When he became sultan, he did not inherit a powerful empire. Instead, he found a divided Anatolia. Old principalities were trying to regain their independence. The army was exhausted, the treasury was nearly empty, and the people had lost confidence in the state. Yet one of the greatest recoveries in Ottoman history began at that very moment. Many historians believe that after the Battle of Ankara, the Ottoman state should have disappeared forever. Instead, by the will and help of Allah, it survived, and it grew strong once again. That is why historians often call Mehmed II the second founder of the Ottoman state. Osman Bey had founded the state, but Mehmed II raised it to its feet for a second time. After winning many campaigns, he ruled successfully until his death in 1421. He was succeeded by his son, Murad II. Murad was still young. Many European rulers believed that the Ottoman state had become weak again. For that reason, rebellions broke out almost as soon as he became sultan. Byzantium returned to its old strategy. It tried to create internal conflict by supporting rival Ottoman princes. During the first years of his reign, Murad II had to fight in both Anatolia and the Balkans at the same time. Despite his young age, he proved far more capable than anyone expected. He crushed the rebellions. He restored Ottoman authority in Anatolia. Then he turned once again toward Europe. A new alliance was forming in the Balkans. Hungary, Poland, Wallachia, and several European states did not want the Ottoman state to regain its strength. The Pope also called for a new crusade. In 1444, the two great armies met near Vienna on the Black Sea coast. The Crusader army was led by King Ladislaw III of Poland and Hungary. The Ottoman army was commanded by Murad II. One of the most dramatic moments of the battle came when the young king personally charged toward the Ottoman center. The attack failed. The king was killed. His army collapsed. The victory at Varna was a devastating disappointment for Europe. For the Ottomans, it proved to the world that their power had fully returned. What makes this even more remarkable is what had happened only a short time before. Murad II had actually stepped down from the throne. He had declared his 12-year-old son, Mehmed, as Sultan. The young Mehmed had begun his reign with great excitement, but Europe saw the child Sultan as the perfect opportunity to attack. As the Crusader army prepared for war, panic spread among the Ottoman statesmen. According to tradition, the young Mehmed sent his father the famous letter that would be remembered for centuries. "If you are the Sultan, then come and lead the army. If I am the Sultan, then I order you to come and lead the army." Murad II returned to command the army, and he won the great victory at Varna. But Europe did not give up. 4 years later, another great alliance was formed. In 1448, the Second Battle of Kosovo began. The battle lasted 3 days. Once again, the Crusader army suffered a crushing defeat. According to many historians, this battle largely ended Europe's hopes of driving the Ottomans out of the Balkans. Constantinople was now almost completely isolated. Its mighty walls still stood, but the city stood alone. In 1451, Murad II died. His son Mehmed became Sultan once again. This time, he was no longer a child. He was 21 years old. Many rulers in Europe still saw him as an inexperienced young man. Byzantium made the same mistake. No one knew that for years, only one goal had filled his mind. A goal that, if achieved, would change not only the future of the Ottoman state, but the course of world history itself. That goal was Constantinople. Since childhood, Sultan Mehmed had never forgotten the words of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. "Constantinople will surely be conquered. What a wonderful commander its commander will be, and what a wonderful army that army will be." Before him stood the strongest walls in the world, but he had no intention of turning back. When Sultan Mehmed, later known as Mehmed the Conqueror, ascended the throne for the second time, the news brought relief to the royal courts of Europe. Many rulers saw the young Mehmed as nothing more than an inexperienced youth. But since childhood, one goal had never left his mind: Constantinople. For nearly 1,000 years, this city had stood strong. It was not only the capital of the Byzantine Empire, it was the last great legacy of the Roman Empire. It stood where East and West met. It controlled the trade route between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and most importantly, it stood as a great obstacle in the middle of Ottoman lands. Mehmed would not accept that. As soon as he became Sultan, he began preparing. From the outside, it looked as if nothing unusual was happening. He renewed peace treaties with neighboring states. He agreed to a temporary truce with Hungary. He kept peaceful relations with the Anatolian principalities. European ambassadors reported that the young Sultan did not appear aggressive, but behind this calm appearance, a massive military plan was taking shape. The first major step was taken on the Bosphorus. On the European side, north of Constantinople, a new fortress began to rise. Rumeli Fortress. This was not simply a defensive fortress, it was a strategic stronghold designed to give the Ottomans complete control over the Bosphorus. On the opposite shore already stood Anadolu Fortress. Working together, the two fortresses could almost completely control any ships trying to bring aid from the Black Sea to Constantinople. When Byzantine ambassadors asked why the fortress was being built, Mehmed gave a short reply. Several versions of his answer exist, but they all carry the same meaning. The Ottomans could build whatever they wished on their own land. Byzantium had no right to interfere. Within a few months, the fortress was complete. Constantinople was now blockaded from the north as well. But this was not Mehmed's greatest surprise. His real plan was to destroy the city's legendary walls. For nearly 1,000 years, they had resisted countless sieges. Arab armies, Bulgarians, Crusaders, all had stood before these walls. None had achieved complete success. Mehmed knew this, so he ordered the construction of the largest cannons the world had ever seen. A Hungarian cannon founder named Urban entered Ottoman service. For months, enormous bronze cannons were cast. The largest was so massive that it could only be moved by hundreds of oxen and dozens of wagons. The journey took weeks. Bridges had to be reinforced, roads had to be widened. Sometimes the cannon advanced only a few kilometers in an entire day. But Mehmed was not in a hurry, because he knew these cannons would destroy more than stone walls. They would change history itself. In April 1453, the Ottoman army arrived outside Constantinople. Historical sources give different estimates for the size of the army, but historians generally agree that the Ottoman forces greatly outnumbered the Byzantine defenders. The defenders numbered only around 7,000 to 8,000 men. Many of them were Genoese and Venetian volunteers. Their commander was the experienced soldier Giovanni Giustiniani. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI also chose to fight personally on the walls. The siege had begun. From the very first days, the Ottoman cannons opened fire. The people of the city had never heard such sounds before. Every explosion shook the mighty walls. Yet progress was slower than expected. Each night, the Byzantines repaired the damaged sections. The stones destroyed during the day were rebuilt before sunrise. This struggle continued for weeks. Meanwhile, the Ottoman fleet tried to enter the Golden Horn, but the entrance was blocked by a massive iron chain stretched across the water. Many commanders believed it was impossible to overcome. Mehmed had a different idea. The ships would not sail into the harbor. They would travel over land. Greased wooden sleds were prepared. Logs were laid across the hills. During a single night, dozens of Ottoman ships were pulled across the hills and lowered into the Golden Horn. When morning came, the Byzantines could hardly believe what they saw. The harbor that had been empty the day before was now filled with Ottoman ships. This completely changed the psychological balance of the siege. The city was now surrounded not only from the land, but from its inner harbor as well. Even so, Constantinople continued to resist. The defense behind the walls proved much stronger than expected. The Ottoman army also suffered heavy losses. Some senior officials even suggested abandoning the siege. In their view, the city could never be taken. Mehmed rejected every suggestion. For him, there was no turning back. Either Constantinople would be conquered, or the whole world would witness the defeat of the Ottoman state. As the days passed, both sides grew exhausted. Finally, Mehmed gave the order for the final assault. The date was May 29th, 1453. Before dawn, the Ottoman army launched its last great attack. Within a few hours, the Eastern Roman Empire, which had survived for nearly 11 centuries, would pass into history. But the most unforgettable moment of this victory would come after the fighting had ended. For when Sultan Mehmed entered the conquered city, he did not enter merely as a victorious commander. He entered as the ruler of a new age. On May 29, 1453, Sultan Mehmed, later known as Mehmed the Conqueror, entered the city with his army. Giovanni Giustiniani was forced to leave the battlefield after being seriously wounded. Soon afterward, the Ottoman banners were raised above the city walls. Church bells rang throughout the city. Panic spread quickly. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI, however, refused to flee. According to historical accounts, he kept his armor on until the very end. He continued fighting alongside his soldiers in the streets. What happened to him afterward is not known with certainty. His body was never positively identified. Most historians believe that he died during the city's final defense. With his death, the Eastern Roman Empire, which had existed for nearly 11 centuries, came to an end. The last Roman emperor was gone. Mehmed prevented the city from being completely destroyed by looting. He was only 21 years old. The city he had dreamed of since childhood now lay before him. According to tradition, he dismounted from his horse, picked up a handful of earth, and silently looked around him. He then rode directly to Hagia Sophia. For centuries, it had been the greatest church of the Orthodox Christian world. Inside, frightened civilians were waiting to learn their fate. When Mehmed entered, he declared that the lives of the people of the city would be protected. He then ordered Hagia Sophia to be converted into a mosque. This decision was not only a religious one, it was also a powerful political declaration that the new capital now officially belonged to the Ottoman state. But Mehmed's greatest achievement did not end with the conquest. The city he had captured was far from its former glory. Its population had fallen dramatically. Many neighborhoods stood empty. Its economy had nearly collapsed. Centuries of war had exhausted Constantinople. Mehmed understood this. He did not want only to conquer the city. He wanted to rebuild it into one of the greatest cities in the world. Thousands of families from Anatolia, Rumelia, the Balkans, and many other regions were settled in the city. Muslims, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, all were invited to live in the new capital. Mehmed sought to build a thriving city where people of different faiths and communities could live and trade together. The foundations of the Grand Bazaar were laid during this period. New madrasas were built, palaces began to rise, water systems were repaired, the harbors came back to life. Constantinople was no longer simply a conquered city. Under its new name, Istanbul, it was becoming the heart of the Ottoman Empire. This conquest changed far more than Ottoman history. It transformed Europe as well. Many historians regard 1453 as the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern age. Many Byzantine scholars fled to Italy. They carried with them hundreds of ancient Greek manuscripts. These works later played an important role in the growth of the European Renaissance. At the same time, European kingdoms began searching for new routes to the east that would avoid Ottoman control over traditional trade routes. The search for sea routes accelerated. Years later, the voyages of Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama would be influenced indirectly by this great conquest. Sultan Mehmed was no longer known simply as a sultan. From that day forward, history would remember him by a single title, Mehmed the Conqueror. But his ambitions were far from over. To him, the conquest of Constantinople was only the beginning. Now his next goal was to transform the Ottoman Empire into a true world empire. While Constantinople was still being rebuilt, the Ottoman armies were already preparing for new campaigns. One of the first targets was Serbia. One of the last major powers threatening Ottoman rule in the Balkans was the region around Belgrade. In 1456, Mehmed laid siege to Belgrade, but there he faced much stronger resistance than he had expected. The city's defense, organized by the Hungarian commander Janos Hunyadi and the Franciscan friar Giovanni da Capistrano, stopped the Ottoman assault. Mehmed himself was seriously wounded. The Ottoman army was forced to withdraw. It was one of the greatest military setbacks of his career. Yet this revealed Mehmed's true character. One defeat did not stop him. He changed his plans, he prepared again, and he advanced on other fronts. Belgrade had not fallen, but the Balkans had not been abandoned. Meanwhile, the last Byzantine territories survived in the Morea. Although Constantinople had fallen, the despotate of the Morea was still ruled by the Palaiologos dynasty. Mehmed would not allow that to continue. In 1460, the Morea was fully incorporated into the Ottoman state. With that, the last major political center of the Byzantine dynasty in Europe disappeared. Mehmed then turned his attention toward the Black Sea. The Empire of Trebizond, founded after breaking away from Byzantium, had survived on the Black Sea coast for nearly 250 years. Its mountains, harbors, and strong walls had protected it for generations. In 1461, Mehmed launched a major campaign. The Ottoman army advanced by both land and sea. The city surrendered. With its fall, the last independent state claiming the Roman legacy disappeared. The Roman inheritance was now entirely in Ottoman hands. But Mehmed was not focused only on the east. Important events were also unfolding in the west. The Kingdom of Bosnia was a key region in Ottoman Balkan policy. After the campaign of 1463, Bosnia largely came under Ottoman rule. Most of the interior Balkans were now under Ottoman control. In Bosnia, Mehmed followed a different policy. Over time, much of the local population adapted to Ottoman rule. The spread of Islam in Bosnia was noticeably faster than in many other Balkan regions. Historians still debate the reasons: social conditions, the tax system, local political dynamics, and religious circumstances. All appear to have played a role. One of Mehmed's most determined opponents was in Albania. Skanderbeg, whose real name was Gjergj Kastrioti, had once been raised in the Ottoman court before returning to his homeland and leading a rebellion against the Ottomans. Through his remarkable military skill, he resisted the Ottoman armies for many years. He used the mountainous terrain to his advantage. He launched sudden attacks with small forces, then disappeared back into the mountains. Mehmed personally led several campaigns into Albania. But as long as Skanderbeg lived, the region could never be brought completely under Ottoman control. After Skanderbeg died in 1468, the resistance gradually weakened. Soon afterward, much of the Adriatic coast came under Ottoman influence. By now, Mehmed had become one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. But his ambitions reached far beyond the Balkans. His eyes turned westward. Across the sea lay Italy, and at the heart of Italy stood Rome. Rome was the city of the Pope and the center of the Christian world. In Mehmed's vision, this was not simply about conquering land. He knew well the Islamic principle that there is no compulsion in religion. His goal was not to force people to convert by the sword. As he had done in Istanbul, he sought to establish an orderly state where people of different faiths could live in safety, while allowing the message of Islam to be heard freely. He also hoped to remove the source of the Crusades that had threatened the Muslim world for centuries. In the summer of 1480, Mehmed's army, commanded by Gedik Ahmed Pasha, landed at Otranto on the southern coast of Italy. On August 11th, the city fell. It became the first permanent Ottoman possession in Italy. Panic spread through Rome. Some accounts even claim that the Pope considered leaving the city. Everyone understood that Otranto was only the beginning. The next target was believed to be Rome. But that dream would never be fulfilled. At the end of April 1481, Mehmed departed on another campaign without revealing his destination. No one knew exactly where he was going. Perhaps Rhodes, perhaps Italy itself. When he reached Gebze, he suddenly became seriously ill. His pain grew unbearable. On May 3rd, 1481 in the afternoon, Mehmed died at only 49 years of age. But did he really die of illness? Some historians do not believe so. The German historian Franz Babinger drawing on archival sources, argued that Mehmed was poisoned. He even claimed that between 12 and 15 assassination attempts had been made against him over the years. According to these accounts, Venice had repeatedly tried to poison Mehmed from as early as 1456. Why? Because for Venice, as long as Mehmed lived, Italy itself remained under threat. The safety of Rome may have depended on the death of a single sultan. Among the suspects was the chief physician Yakup Pasha, who was accused by some sources of being bribed by the Venetians. The truth has never been proven, but one fact is certain. The moment Mehmed died, the greatest threat facing Rome disappeared. Otranto was retaken the following year, and Europe would never again face an Ottoman conquest that came so close to its heart. The unfinished dream of one sultan remains one of history's greatest what-if questions. After Mehmed's death, his son Bayezid II became sultan. He was a calmer ruler, but another name would soon rise to the Ottoman throne, a ruler known for his harsh determination, decisive leadership, and extraordinary conquests achieved in only 8 years. His name was Yavuz Sultan Selim. During his reign, the Ottoman Empire would become more than just a great empire. It would also assume the political leadership of the Islamic world. Bayezid II, the son of Mehmed the Conqueror, did not leave as great a mark on history as his father. He followed a more peaceful policy. As he grew older and became ill, rivalry among his sons began to grow. The most determined of them was Selim, the governor of Trabzon. He was strict, he was decisive, and he believed that his father was acting too cautiously. Because in the east, a new and dangerous power was rising, the Safavid Empire. Founded under the leadership of Shah Ismail, the Safavid state quickly took control of much of Persia. But this was not only about territory. The Safavids had made Shia Islam the official ideology of their state, and their influence was spreading among some Turkmen communities in Anatolia. For the Ottomans, this was no longer only a matter of foreign policy. It had become an internal security threat. Selim saw this clearly. Bayezid preferred a more cautious approach. Eventually, the disagreement between father and son grew too great. In 1512, Bayezid abdicated. Selim became the new sultan. History would remember him by one name, Yavuz Sultan Selim. From the moment he took the throne, his first objective never changed: the East. He believed that the Ottoman state could never be truly secure unless Shah Ismail was defeated. In 1514, the two great rulers met on the plain of Chaldiran. Shah Ismail was an outstanding commander. His army relied on fast-moving cavalry. He had won most of the battles he had fought. But the Ottoman army possessed one decisive advantage: cannons and firearms. When the battle began, the Safavid cavalry charged as they always had, but the Ottoman artillery and musketeers stopped their attack. Within only a few hours, the Battle of Chaldiran turned in favor of the Ottomans. Shah Ismail was forced to retreat. The Ottoman army advanced as far as Tabriz. The significance of this victory went far beyond the battlefield. Much of eastern Anatolia came under Ottoman control. The Safavid advance was stopped, and the Ottoman eastern frontier remained largely secure for many years. But Yavuz had an even greater objective: the south. In Egypt, the Mamluk Sultanate still ruled. The Mamluks were not only a powerful military state, they were also the guardians of Makkah and Medina. Cairo was one of the greatest centers of Islamic scholarship. Yavuz now turned his army south. In 1516, the Battle of Marj Dabik took place near Syria. Once again, the Ottoman army was victorious. The Mamluk Sultan Kansu al-Ghauri was killed. Soon afterward, Damascus came under Ottoman rule. But the campaign was not yet over. The following year, the Ottoman army marched into Egypt. The final great battle took place near Cairo at Ridania. In 1517, the Mamluk army was defeated. The last Mamluk Sultan, Tuman Bey, was captured. Soon afterward, he was executed. The Mamluk Sultanate, which had ruled for nearly 2.5 centuries, came to an end. For the Ottoman state, this victory was perhaps as significant as the conquest of Constantinople itself. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, the Hejaz, Makkah, Medina, and much of the Red Sea region now came under Ottoman rule. The holiest cities of Islam were now protected by the Ottoman state. At this point, one important tradition is often mentioned: the transfer of the Caliphate to the Ottomans. According to traditional Ottoman historical accounts, the last Abbasid Caliph al-Mutawakkil III transferred the symbols of the Caliphate to Yavuz Sultan Selim. After the Egyptian campaign, the Ottoman Empire became the most powerful political state in the Islamic world. It assumed responsibility for serving Makkah and Medina. The sacred relics were brought to Istanbul, and the Ottoman sultans came to be seen not only as rulers of a great empire, but also as the most influential political leaders of the Islamic world. All of this happened in only 8 years. Yavuz Sultan Selim's reign lasted from 1512 to 1520, just 8 years. Yet during that short time, he nearly doubled the size of the Ottoman Empire. History often follows an interesting pattern. Sometimes the greatest rulers prepare the way for someone even greater. When Yavuz died, his son succeeded him. No one yet knew that the Ottoman Empire was about to reach its greatest height. His name was Sultan Suleiman, known to history as Suleiman the Magnificent. During his reign, the Ottoman Empire would become not only the leading power of the Islamic world, but one of the greatest superpowers on earth. In 1520, Sultan Suleiman, later known as Suleiman the Magnificent, ascended the Ottoman throne. At just 26 years old, he inherited one of the greatest empires in the world. In the royal courts of Europe, many wondered, can someone so young really rule such a vast empire? The answer came quickly. Over the next 46 years, the Ottoman Empire would experience the greatest age in its history. In the West, he became known as Suleiman the Magnificent. In Ottoman sources, however, he was more often called Kanuni Sultan Suleiman, Suleiman the lawgiver. His greatness came not only from his victories in war, but also from the legal system he built. Yet during the first years of his reign, it would not be law that spoke. It would be the sword. His first target was Belgrade. Even Mehmed the Conqueror had failed to capture this city. Known as the southern gateway to Hungary, Belgrade stood at the meeting point of the Danube and Sava rivers. Whoever controlled this fortress held the key to Central Europe. In 1521, the Ottoman army returned to Belgrade. This time, the preparations were far more complete. The city was surrounded from both land and river. For days, Ottoman cannons pounded the walls. The defenders fought desperately, but now they faced the empire that had conquered Constantinople. Belgrade fell. Its capture sent shockwaves across Europe. The Ottoman Empire had now moved beyond the Balkans. Suleiman wasted no time. His next objective was one of the strongest naval strongholds in the Mediterranean, Rhodes. The island was controlled by the Knights of St. John. For years, they had attacked Muslim merchant ships in the eastern Mediterranean and threatened Ottoman sea routes. Even Mehmed the Conqueror had failed to capture the island. Suleiman intended to finish what his grandfather had begun. The siege of 1522 lasted for months. The knights fought with remarkable discipline. Their fortifications were among the strongest in Europe. Every street became a battlefield. In the end, the knights agreed to surrender. Suleiman made a remarkable decision. He guaranteed their safety and allowed them to leave the island. Even in Europe, this act earned him respect. With Rhodes secured, the eastern Mediterranean came largely under Ottoman control. But Suleiman's greatest challenge still lay ahead: Hungary. At the beginning of the 16th century, the Kingdom of Hungary was one of the strongest powers in Central Europe. It also served as the buffer between the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg dynasty. In 1526, the two great armies met on the plain of Mohacs. King Louis II of Hungary was young. His army appeared powerful. Many European knights fought at his side, but by now the Ottoman army had reached an entirely new level of military organization. Suleiman carefully chose the battlefield. He positioned his artillery in the best locations. The Janissaries waited at the center. The heavy Hungarian cavalry launched a massive charge, exactly as Suleiman had expected. The Ottoman front line slowly withdrew in an organized retreat. As the Hungarian forces advanced, their formations began to break apart. At that moment, the Ottoman cannons opened fire. The Janissaries met the charge with volleys of musket fire. Ottoman cavalry attacked from both flanks. Within about 2 hours, the battle was over. Yes, only 2 hours. The Hungarian army was almost completely destroyed. Most of Hungary came under Ottoman influence. Now only one great obstacle remained before the Ottoman army: Vienna. In 1529, the Ottoman army arrived outside the city. It was the first siege of Vienna. All of Europe watched anxiously. If Vienna fell, many believed the Ottomans could advance deep into Germany. But this time, nature stood against them. Heavy rains turned the roads into mud. Many of the largest cannons could not be brought forward. Supplying the army became increasingly difficult. The siege began. But the city's defenses held firm. The weather continued to worsen. With winter approaching, Suleiman made an important decision. He withdrew his army. It was not a great Ottoman defeat, but neither was it a great victory. Vienna had survived. Still, Europe had learned one unforgettable lesson. The Ottoman army could reach the very heart of the continent, but Suleiman was fighting on more than land. A new era was also beginning at sea. The greatest figure of that age was Barbaros Hayreddin Pasha. His birth name was Kidr. Together with his brother Oruk Reis, he had gained fame across the Mediterranean before entering Ottoman service. Suleiman appointed him Kapudan Pasha, the Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet. In 1538, at the Battle of Preveza, Barbaros defeated the Great Holy League fleet commanded by Andrea Doria. The importance of this victory is sometimes overshadowed by Mohacs, yet its consequences were enormous. After Preveza, for nearly 30 years, no navy could seriously challenge Ottoman dominance in the Mediterranean. The Ottoman Empire had become master not only of the land, but also of the sea. Stretching from Istanbul to Algiers, from Buda to the Persian Gulf, from Crimea to Yemen. The empire united peoples of different nations, languages, and religions under one government. Yet Suleiman was concerned with more than conquest. He reorganized the legal codes. He reformed the tax system. He strengthened the courts. He made the institutions of the state even more stable. That is why Ottoman historians called him Kanuni, the lawgiver. His greatest legacy was not only the battles he won, it was the system he built. But at the peak of every great empire, an unseen danger begins to grow. When a state reaches its greatest strength, it often begins to change in ways that few can see. During Suleiman's later years, struggles for influence within the palace became more intense. Competition among the princes grew increasingly bitter. Decisions were being made that would deeply shape the future of the Ottoman Empire. Almost no one realized it, because everyone still believed the Ottoman Empire was invincible. But the wheel of history had already begun to turn. The year was 1566. Kanuni Sultan Suleiman had ruled the Ottoman Empire for nearly half a century. The most powerful rulers of Europe had come and gone. Popes had changed. Kings had died and been replaced. Yet the same man still sat on the Ottoman throne. He was now over 70 years old. His hair had turned grey. Even so, he decided to lead his army on one final campaign. The target was the fortress of Sigetvar in Hungary. At first glance, it did not seem like a great prize, but because of its strategic position on the Habsburg frontier, it was of enormous importance. Suleiman did not know that this would be the last campaign of his life. While the siege was still underway, on the night of September 7th, 1566, he died inside his imperial tent. What happened next was extraordinary. Grand Vizier Sokulu Mehmed Pasha did not allow news of the Sultan's death to spread through the army. The siege was still in progress. If the soldiers learned that their Sultan had died, panic might follow. The army could even abandon the campaign. For that reason, Suleiman's death was kept secret for several days. Official orders continued to be issued in his name. The guards remained at his tent as if nothing had happened. Some historical accounts even state that officials continued entering and leaving his tent to preserve the appearance that the Sultan was still alive. Soon afterward, Shigatvar fell. Only then was Suleiman's death announced. An era that had lasted nearly 46 years had come to an end. The Ottoman Empire had reached almost the greatest extent of its history, from Buda to Yemen, from Algiers to the Persian Gulf, from Crimea to Sudan. An enormous empire was governed from a single center, but how could such a powerful empire begin to decline? The interesting part is this: the decline did not begin suddenly. Its first signs appeared quietly, and almost nobody noticed them. During Suleiman's later years, the balance of power inside the palace had begun to change. Competition among the princes was no longer only a military matter. Women of the imperial household, grand viziers, senior officials, and powerful political factions all became involved. One of the most discussed figures of this period was Hurrem Sultan. For the first time in Ottoman history, the wife of a sultan began exercising such significant influence within the imperial court. Many of the stories told about Hurrem Sultan over the centuries have become mixed with legend. European writers, in particular, often portrayed her as the woman who controlled nearly every political decision. Modern historians generally consider many of these claims to be exaggerated. Even so, there is little doubt that Hurrem Sultan was an influential figure in palace politics. The greatest controversy surrounded Prince Mustafa. Mustafa was one of Suleiman's eldest sons. He was highly respected within the army. Many leading officials believed that he would become the next sultan. Over time, however, accusations began to spread. He was accused of preparing a rebellion, of trying to seize the throne, of plotting against his own father. During the Persian campaign of 1553, Suleiman made one of the most difficult decisions of his reign. Prince Mustafa was summoned to the imperial tent. When he entered, executioners were waiting. Within a short time, he was strangled to death. His death caused deep sorrow among both the army and the people. To this day, it remains one of the most controversial decisions in Ottoman history. Suleiman's other son, Bayezid, later challenged his brother Selim in an unsuccessful struggle for the throne. He fled to Persia, but the Safavid Shah eventually handed him over to the Ottomans. Bayezid and his sons were executed. Only one prince remained, Prince Selim. When Suleiman died in 1566, Selim II became sultan. Unlike his father and grandfather, he preferred not to spend his reign on military campaigns. As a result, the influence of Grand Vizier Sokulu Mehmed Pasha became even greater. Sokulu was one of the greatest statesmen the Ottoman Empire ever produced. He had originally come from a Christian family in Bosnia through the Devshirme system. He was educated in the Enderun school and eventually rose to the highest office in the empire. His career reflected how the Ottoman system often worked. A person's birth did not determine his future. Service to the state did. During Sokulu's leadership, the Ottoman Empire remained powerful. Cyprus was conquered. The Eastern Mediterranean came largely under Ottoman control, but this conquest prompted the formation of a new Holy League. Spain, Venice, the papacy, and several other European states united against the Ottomans. In 1571, the two great fleets met in the Gulf of Lepanto. It became one of the largest naval battles in Mediterranean history. The Ottoman fleet was powerful, but the Holy League fleet was better organized. By the end of the battle, most of the Ottoman fleet had been destroyed. Around 200 ships were lost. Tens of thousands of sailors were killed or captured. Europe celebrated the victory with great enthusiasm. For the first time in centuries, the Ottoman navy had suffered such a devastating defeat. But what happened next surprised everyone. Many Europeans believed that the Ottoman Empire would now begin to collapse. It did not. Sultan Mehmed Pasha immediately ordered the construction of a new fleet. The shipyards worked day and night. In less than a year, hundreds of new Ottoman warships had returned to the sea. A famous saying is traditionally attributed to Sultan Mehmed Pasha when speaking to the Venetian ambassador, "By taking Cyprus, we cut off your arm. At Lepanto, you merely shaved our beard. A severed arm never grows back, but a shaved beard grows back even thicker." Whether he spoke these exact words is uncertain. What is certain is that the Ottoman Empire rebuilt its navy with remarkable speed after the battle. Even so, the importance of Lepanto should not be underestimated. It was the first great sign that the Ottoman Empire could be defeated. The empire was still immensely powerful. Its territories continued to expand. Its economy remained one of the largest in the world. But unseen problems were quietly beginning to grow. The population was increasing rapidly. The global value of silver was changing. New trade routes were reducing the empire's traditional commercial advantages. And Europe was investing more heavily than ever in military technology. None of these developments meant immediate decline, but they were the first signs of the great transformation that lay ahead. The Ottoman Empire's golden age was not yet over, but the first fine cracks had begun to appear in the gold. The year was 1566. Kanuni Sultan Suleiman had ruled the Ottoman Empire for nearly half a century. The most powerful rulers of Europe had come and gone. Popes had changed. Kings had died and been replaced. Yet the same man still sat on the Ottoman throne. He was now over 70 years old. His hair had turned grey. Even so, he decided to lead his army on one final campaign. The target was the fortress of Sigetvar in Hungary. At first glance, it did not seem like a great prize. But because of its strategic position on the Habsburg frontier, it was of enormous importance. Suleiman did not know that this would be the last campaign of his life. While the siege was still underway, on the night of September 7, 1566, he died inside his imperial tent. What happened next was extraordinary. Grand Vizier Sokulu Mehmed Pasha did not allow news of the Sultan's death to spread through the army. The siege was still in progress. If the soldiers learned that their Sultan had died, panic might follow. The army could even abandon the campaign. For that reason, Suleiman's death was kept secret for several days. Official orders continued to be issued in his name. The guards remained at his tent as if nothing had happened. Some historical accounts even state that officials continued entering and leaving his tent to preserve the appearance that the Sultan was still alive. Soon afterward, Sigetvar fell. Only then was Suleiman's death announced. An era that had lasted nearly 46 years had come to an end. The Ottoman Empire had reached almost the greatest extent of its history, from Buda to Yemen, from Algiers to the Persian Gulf, from Crimea to Sudan. An enormous empire was governed from a single center, but how could such a powerful empire begin to decline? The interesting part is this: the decline did not begin suddenly. Its first signs appeared quietly, and almost nobody noticed them. During Suleiman's later years, the balance of power inside the palace had begun to change. Competition among the princes was no longer only a military matter. Women of the imperial household, grand viziers, senior officials, and powerful political factions all became involved. One of the most discussed figures of this period was Hurrem Sultan. For the first time in Ottoman history, the wife of a sultan began exercising such significant influence within the imperial court. Many of the stories told about Hurrem Sultan over the centuries have become mixed with legend. European writers, in particular, often portrayed her as the woman who controlled nearly every political decision. Modern historians generally consider many of these claims to be exaggerated. Even so, there is little doubt that Hurrem Sultan was an influential figure in palace politics. The greatest controversy surrounded Prince Mustafa. Mustafa was one of Suleiman's eldest sons. He was highly respected within the army. Many leading officials believed that he would become the next sultan. Over time, however, accusations began to spread. He was accused of preparing a rebellion, of trying to seize the throne, of plotting against his own father. During the Persian campaign of 1553, Suleiman made one of the most difficult decisions of his reign. Prince Mustafa was summoned to the imperial tent. When he entered, executioners were waiting. Within a short time, he was strangled to death. His death caused deep sorrow among both the army and the people. To this day, it remains one of the most controversial decisions in Ottoman history. Suleiman's other son, Bayezid, later challenged his brother Selim in an unsuccessful struggle for the throne. He fled to Persia, but the Safavid Shah eventually handed him over to the Ottomans. Bayezid and his sons were executed. Only one prince remained, Prince Selim. When Suleiman died in 1566, Selim II became sultan. Unlike his father and grandfather, he preferred not to spend his reign on military campaigns. As a result, the influence of Grand Vizier Sokulu Mehmed Pasha became even greater. Sokulu was one of the greatest statesmen the Ottoman Empire ever produced. He had originally come from a Christian family in Bosnia through the Devshirme system. He was educated in the Enderun school and eventually rose to the highest office in the empire. His career reflected how the Ottoman system often worked. A person's birth did not determine his future. Service to the state did. During Sokulu's leadership, the Ottoman Empire remained powerful. Cyprus was conquered. The Eastern Mediterranean came largely under Ottoman control, but this conquest prompted the formation of a new Holy League. Spain, Venice, the papacy, and several other European states united against the Ottomans. In 1571, the two great fleets met in the Gulf of Lepanto. It became one of the largest naval battles in Mediterranean history. The Ottoman fleet was powerful, but the Holy League fleet was better organized. Descending from Kahlenberg Hill, the Allied Christian army attacked the Ottoman forces. The massive cavalry charge, especially by the famous Polish winged hussars, proved decisive. After hours of fierce fighting, the Ottoman army was forced to retreat. The second siege of Vienna had failed. This was not simply the loss of a battle. It marked the end of an era. From that point onward, the European powers would no longer remain on the defensive. They would begin to push back. The great Ottoman advance that had continued for nearly 3 centuries had come to an end. Now, the direction of history began to reverse. The empire that had once conquered new lands would increasingly become an empire struggling to defend the territories it already possessed. In 1683, as the Ottoman army withdrew from the gates of Vienna, many soldiers believed it was simply a failed siege. No one yet realized that it marked the end of an era that had lasted for 3 centuries. Because after Vienna, it was not only one battle that changed, Europe's way of thinking changed. For centuries, the European powers had waited for the arrival of the Ottoman armies. Now, for the first time, they began to unite around a common goal. Their objective was no longer simply to defend themselves, it was to drive the Ottoman Empire out of Europe. To achieve this, a great alliance was formed under the leadership of the Pope. History would remember it as the Holy League. Its members included Habsburg Austria, Poland, Venice, later Russia, and several other European states. The Ottoman Empire now found itself fighting on 4 or 5 fronts at the same time. The Ottoman army was still powerful. The Janissaries were still among the most experienced soldiers in Europe. But Europe was no longer the same. Permanent armies had been established. Artillery technology had advanced. Officer training had become systematic. Wars were no longer won by courage alone. Science, logistics, and discipline became more important with every passing year. The Ottoman Empire struggled to keep pace with these changes. The Battle of Zenta in 1697 became one of the clearest examples. Sultan Mustafa II personally led the Ottoman army. While the Ottoman forces were crossing the Tisa River, the Austrian commander Prince Eugene of Savoy launched a sudden attack. The Ottoman army was caught completely by surprise. Chaos broke out on the bridges. Thousands of soldiers were killed. The Grand Vizier also died in the battle. This was more than a military defeat. Continuing the war now seemed almost impossible. After long negotiations, the Treaty of Karlowitz was signed in 1699. This treaty holds a unique place in Ottoman history. For the first time, the empire officially accepted the loss of large territories. Most of Hungary was ceded to Austria. For the first time, the Ottoman Empire found itself on the defensive against Europe. The psychological impact was enormous. In earlier centuries, European ambassadors had come to Istanbul seeking peace. Now, Ottoman ambassadors were traveling to the capitals of Europe. This new reality forced Ottoman statesmen to ask difficult questions. What had gone wrong? Why could the empire no longer win as it once had? At the beginning of the 18th century, different answers began to emerge. The Treaty of Passarowitz, signed in 1718, opened the door to a new era. Tired of constant warfare, the empire chose peace for a time. The most famous symbol of this period was the tulip. Today, when people hear the phrase tulip period, many think only of luxury and entertainment. The reality was more complex. Yes, magnificent gardens were created around the imperial court in Istanbul. Growing tulips became a great fashion. Poetry gatherings were held. New architectural works were built. Festivals filled the capital. But the tulip period was about more than entertainment. For the first time, the Ottoman Empire began studying Europe much more carefully. Ambassadors were sent to Paris, Vienna, and other European cities. They did far more than conduct diplomacy. They returned with detailed reports describing everything they had seen. Military academies, factories, gardens, architecture, printing presses, all were carefully examined. During these years, one of the most important innovations in Ottoman history took place. The Ibrahim Müteferrika printing press was established. Beginning its work in 1727, it is generally recognized as the first official printing press to publish books in Turkish within the Ottoman Empire. There is an important detail here. Printing itself was not a new technology. Jewish, Armenian, and Greek communities within the Ottoman lands had already been using printing presses in their own languages. The real innovation was that with official approval, Turkish books now began to be printed systematically. This was an important step toward wider access to knowledge. But change is never easy. New ideas do not always receive immediate support. Some groups believed that European influence was becoming too strong. Many Ottoman statesmen of that time believed that by imitating Europe, the empire could return to its former greatness. Yet, from an Islamic perspective, many believed that both the rulers and much of society had begun moving away from the teachings of Islam, and that Allah was allowing these hardships as a lesson. At the time, however, few truly understood that lesson. Although some religious scholars warned the people, the course of events did not change. The movement toward westernization continued. Economic problems also remained. As the state drifted further away from Islamic principles, luxury spending increased, and many ordinary people openly criticized it. Finally, in 1730, a major uprising broke out in Istanbul. Its leader was Patrona Halil. A former Janissary, he quickly gathered widespread support. The rebels marched toward the palace. Grand Vizier Nevzehirli Damat Ibrahim Pasha was executed. Sultan Ahmed III was forced from the throne. The tulip period came to an end. This was not simply the fall of one ruler. The Ottoman leadership had learned an important lesson. Change was necessary, but reforms introduced before society was ready could provoke powerful resistance. For the next 100 years, the Ottoman Empire would struggle with this very dilemma: tradition on one side, change on the other. The old military system on one side, a rapidly industrializing Europe on the other, and with every passing year, the distance between those two worlds continued to grow. The empire was still enormous. Millions of people still lived under the Ottoman banner. But the real question had now become, would the Ottoman Empire truly understand the root of its problems and find a way to solve them? The world had changed. Across Europe, factories were being built, steam engines were transforming industry, science and engineering were advancing rapidly. Armies were no longer made up only of brave soldiers. Officers trained in mathematics, modern artillery, engineers, cartographers, and professional soldiers who trained continuously were now deciding the outcome of wars. The Ottoman Empire, however, still relied largely on its old military system. Its leadership had become weakened by complacency, comfort, and pride. The Islamic purpose and sense of mission that had driven the empire during its rise had largely faded. Without that spirit, many leaders focused instead on creating new systems by imitating the West. When Selim III ascended the throne in 1789, Europe itself was undergoing a great transformation. The French Revolution had begun. The absolute authority of kings was being challenged. Ideas of nationalism were spreading. A new age was emerging. Selim III watched these developments closely. Believing that the entire state needed renewal, he launched the reform program that became known as the New Order, Nizam-i-Shedid. Soldiers were trained according to European methods. New barracks were built. The artillery was reorganized. Foreign military experts were invited to Istanbul. For the first time in Ottoman history, permanent embassies were established in major European capitals. Ottoman ambassadors were no longer sent only to negotiate treaties. They also observed the countries where they served, reported technological developments, and brought new ideas back to Istanbul. But every major reform creates people who feel threatened. The strongest opposition came from the Janissaries. For centuries, the Janissary Corps had been the elite military force of the Ottoman Empire. By this time, however, it had lost much of its old discipline. What had once been an army of professional soldiers had become an organization whose members engaged in trade, worked as craftsmen, interfered in politics, and at times even removed sultans from the throne. They viewed Selim III's new army as a direct threat to their own position. In 1807, they revolted. Istanbul fell into chaos. Selim III was removed from the throne. Soon afterward, he was killed. Many of the reforms he had dreamed of remained unfinished, but his ideas did not die. A few years later, another ruler would face the same challenge, Mahmud II. Mahmud II acted with great patience. First, he strengthened his position within the government. Then he waited for the right moment. Finally, in 1826, one of the most dramatic events in Ottoman history took place. The Janissaries rebelled once again. This time, the Sultan did not retreat. Cannons were turned against the Janissary barracks in Istanbul. After hours of fighting, the barracks were set on fire. Thousands of Janissaries were killed. The Janissary Corps was abolished forever. This event became known in Ottoman history as the auspicious incident, Vaka-i The name reflects the view of the Ottoman government. In reality, many people lost their lives, and an institution that had stood at the center of the empire for centuries was completely destroyed. Historians generally see the event both as a turning point that opened the way for modernization and as a violent purge. Mahmud II did not stop there. He reorganized the state administration. New ministries were established. New regulations were introduced for civil servants. Dress reforms were implemented. The postal system was expanded. The first modern population censuses were carried out. Modern medical schools and military academies were opened. Step by step, the Ottoman state was becoming something very different. Yet while these reforms were taking place, problems beyond the empire continued to grow. A movement for Greek independence began. Nationalism was spreading throughout the Balkans. In 1827, at the Battle of Navarino, the Ottoman and Egyptian fleets were destroyed by the combined navies of Britain, France, and Russia. The disaster dealt a severe blow to Ottoman naval power. Soon afterward, Greece gained its independence. This was not merely the loss of territory. It became an example for many other peoples living within the empire. When Mehmed II died in 1839, his young son Abdul I succeeded him. That same year, one of the most important documents in Ottoman history was proclaimed, the Tanzimat Edict. Read publicly in Gülhane Park, the decree aimed to provide new guarantees for all Ottoman subjects: protection of life, protection of property, tax reform, military service, the court system. All were to be reorganized. The goal was clear: to make the state more just, more orderly, and more modern. In 1856, the Reform Edict, Islahat Fermani, was proclaimed. The rights of the empire's non-Muslim subjects were expanded. The Ottoman government sought to build an administration that was closer to contemporary European legal standards. But reform alone could not solve every problem. While the Industrial Revolution was making Europe extraordinarily wealthy, the Ottoman economy struggled to keep pace. Railways, factories, banks, modern industry, all were transforming Europe at remarkable speed. The Ottoman Empire tried to follow these changes, but it often remained behind. Even so, it would be incomplete to describe this period simply as one of decline. Many of the foundations of modern education, legal institutions, public administration, and the modern state were laid during the Tanzimat era. The Ottoman Empire was no longer the old Ottoman Empire, but it had not yet become a new one. It stood between two worlds, and even greater storms lay ahead. Nationalism continued to grow throughout the Balkans. European powers intervened more and more in Ottoman affairs. The empire's financial position weakened year after year. The question was no longer simply whether the Ottomans could win another war. It was whether the empire itself could survive. By the end of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was trying to survive in a completely different world. The empire that had once shaped the destiny of Europe now found itself carefully watching every move Europe made. Britain had become the world's greatest naval power. France had accelerated its industrial development. Germany had rapidly become one of Europe's strongest military powers. Meanwhile, Russia remained determined to expand southward and gain access to warm water seas. The Ottoman Empire stood between all of these competing powers, and each of them had its own interests within Ottoman territory. In 1876, Sultan Abdul Hamid II came to the throne in the middle of this difficult situation. Only a few months later, one of the most devastating wars in Ottoman history began, the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, known in Turkish history as the War of 93. This was not simply another military defeat. It became a turning point that changed the future of the empire. Russian armies advanced rapidly through the Balkans. At Plevna, Osman Pasha organized an extraordinary defense. His resistance lasted for months and was admired even by European newspapers. But heroic resistance was not enough to change the outcome of the war. In the east, Russian forces advanced as far as Erzurum. In the west, they reached Yeşilköy, just outside Istanbul. For the first time in centuries, the Ottoman capital faced such a direct threat. The Ottoman government was forced to seek peace. The Treaty of San Stefano was signed, but the European powers did not want Russia to become too powerful. For that reason, the Congress of Berlin met later that same year. The Treaty of Berlin imposed severe consequences on the Ottoman Empire. Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania became fully independent. Bulgaria gained broad autonomy. The administration of Bosnia and Herzegovina was handed to Austria-Hungary. Cyprus came under British administration. Once again, the map of the Ottoman Empire became smaller. Yet Abdul Hamid II was concerned with more than war. Shortly after becoming Sultan, he had introduced constitutional government. The first Ottoman parliament was opened. However, using the war as justification, he suspended parliament. For nearly 30 years afterward, he ruled through a highly centralized government. Today, historians continue to debate Abdul Hamid II. Some see him as the statesman who kept the empire alive for another 3 decades. Others describe him as an authoritarian ruler who restricted political freedoms. Although opinions differ, historians largely agree on one point. He ruled during one of the most difficult periods in Ottoman history. He faced not only foreign enemies, but also economic crises, nationalist movements, and constant pressure from the great European powers. Even so, he carried out several important projects. The most symbolic was the Hejaz Railway. Construction began in 1900. It was far more than an economic investment. Stretching from Damascus to Medina, the railway made the pilgrimage easier, improved military transportation, and strengthened the Ottoman connection with its Arab provinces. A significant portion of the project was financed through donations from Muslims across the world. For that reason, the Hejaz Railway came to be seen not only as an Ottoman achievement, but as a project of the wider Islamic world. Meanwhile, a new generation was emerging inside the empire. Young officers educated in modern military schools closely followed political ideas from Europe. They believed that the empire could only be saved through broader reforms. The most influential organization among them became the Committee of Union and Progress. Founded as a secret movement, it gradually gained strong support within the military. In 1908, pressure from officers in Macedonia forced Abdul Hamid II to restore constitutional government. The second constitutional era began. Parliament reopened. A new chapter in Ottoman history had started, but peace did not last long. After the 31st of March incident in 1909, the Action Army marched into Istanbul. Abdul Hamid II was removed from the throne. He was succeeded by Mehmed V Rashad. From that point onward, the influence of the Committee of Union and Progress steadily increased. Yet an even greater disaster was approaching. In 1912, the Balkan Wars began. They became one of the greatest military catastrophes in Ottoman history. Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, Montenegro, all united against the Ottoman Empire. Within only a few months, territories that had remained under Ottoman rule for centuries were lost. Many of the empire's most important European cities disappeared from Ottoman control. During the Balkan Wars, hundreds of thousands of Muslims were forced to flee to Anatolia. Many died along the way. Families were torn apart. Cities that had belonged to the Ottoman Empire for centuries now lay within the borders of other states. This defeat was more than military. It left deep scars on the memory of Ottoman society. The leaders of the Committee of Union and Progress reached one conclusion: the empire could no longer survive alone. It needed a powerful ally. At the very same time, Europe was dividing into two great alliances. On one side stood Britain, France, and Russia. On the other stood Germany, Austria-Hungary, and their allies. Then, in the summer of 1914, an assassination took place in Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was killed. At first, it appeared to be only another political assassination. But within weeks, it ignited a war that would engulf the entire world. The Ottoman Empire now faced perhaps the most difficult decision in its 600-year history. Would it enter the war, or could it remain neutral? The answer would determine not only the future of the government, but the fate of the empire itself. The year was 1914. Europe was on fire. A crisis that began with a single assassination quickly grew into the largest war the world had ever seen. Today we call it World War I. But at the time, no one knew that the war would last 4 years, that millions of people would die, or that 4 great empires would disappear from history. At first, the Ottoman Empire tried to remain neutral. The Balkan Wars had only recently ended. The army was exhausted. The economy was weak. The treasury was nearly empty. Most Ottoman leaders knew that another war could be disastrous, but international politics left little room for neutrality. Britain and France did not trust the Ottoman Empire. Russia had not abandoned its ambitions over the Turkish Straits. Within the Ottoman leadership, it was also widely believed that Britain and France intended to dismantle the Ottoman Empire after the war and divide its lands, together with Russia. For this reason, the Ottoman government moved closer to Germany. On August 2, 1914, a secret alliance was signed. Even then, the Ottoman Empire did not immediately enter the war. The turning point came a few months later. The German warships Goeben and Breslau escaped through the Mediterranean and reached Istanbul. They were later transferred to the Ottoman Navy and renamed Yavuz Sultan Selim and Midilli. On October 29, 1914, Russian ports on the Black Sea were bombarded. Soon afterward, Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire. Britain and France followed. There was no turning back. The empire would now fight on multiple fronts at the same time: the Caucasus, Gallipoli, Iraq, Palestine, Arabia, Galicia, Yemen. One of the widest wars in Ottoman history had begun. The first great disaster came in the east. During the winter of 1914, Enver Pasha planned to surround the Russian army at Sarıkamış. The plan was bold, but the weather had been fatally underestimated. Ottoman soldiers struggled through snow that reached several meters deep. Many did not even have proper winter clothing. Thousands died from the freezing cold before ever reaching the enemy. The Sarıkamış campaign ended in disaster. It remains one of the greatest tragedies of the war. Yet only a few months later, events on another front would change world history. Gallipoli. The Allied plan was clear: force the Dardanelles, capture Istanbul, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and open a secure supply route to Russia. In March 1915, one of the most powerful fleets in the world entered the Dardanelles. British and French battleships advanced through the strait, but they did not fully know the locations of the Ottoman minefields. On March 18th, within only a few hours, several major warships struck mines: Bouvet, Irresistible, Ocean. One after another, they sank. The Allied fleet was forced to withdraw. The Allies then launched a land invasion. On the morning of April 25, 1915, thousands of soldiers landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula. After months of fierce fighting, the Allied forces withdrew. The Gallipoli victory became a major turning point, not only for the Ottoman Empire, but for world history. Istanbul had been saved. The Ottoman Empire remained in the war. Meanwhile, another remarkable victory was won on the Iraqi front. In 1916, British forces under General Charles Townshend were surrounded at Kut al-Amara. After months of resistance, around 13,000 British troops surrendered. It was one of the greatest military humiliations the British Empire had suffered up to that time. But as the war continued, Ottoman resources were steadily exhausted. One of the most difficult fronts was Arabia. In 1916, Sharif Hussein of Makkah launched a revolt against Ottoman rule. Britain supported the uprising. The British officer T.E. Lawrence, later known as Lawrence of Arabia, worked alongside Arab forces. However, one important fact should not be forgotten. The Arab revolt did not represent all Arabs. Hundreds of thousands of Arab soldiers continued fighting in the Ottoman army. Arab units fought alongside the Ottomans in Iraq, in Palestine, at Gallipoli, and on many other fronts. For that reason, it would be historically inaccurate to describe the war simply as a conflict between Turks and Arabs. In 1917, British forces under General Edmund Allenby entered Jerusalem. 1 year later, Damascus fell. The Palestinian front was collapsing. When Bulgaria withdrew from the war, the Ottoman Empire also lost its land connection with Europe. Continuing the war became almost impossible. On October 30th, 1918, the Armistice of Mudros was signed. The Ottoman Empire had effectively surrendered. Soon afterward, the Allied powers began occupying large parts of Anatolia and Thrace. On November 13th, 1918, the Allied fleet entered Istanbul. For the first time in centuries, one of the world's greatest capitals came under the control of foreign armies. For millions of people, the sight was heartbreaking. But the story was not yet over. A new resistance movement was beginning in Anatolia, led by Mustafa Kemal, an Ottoman officer officially appointed by the empire's last sultan. The Turkish national movement launched a new struggle against the occupation. In 1922, the Turkish forces achieved victory. That same year, the Grand National Assembly of Turkey made a historic decision. On November 1st, 1922, the Ottoman Sultanate was abolished. The political rule of the Ottoman dynasty, which had lasted for approximately 623 years, came to an end. The last sultan, Mehmed VI Vahdettin, soon left Istanbul. In 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne was signed. On October 29, 1923, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed. 1 year later, on March 3, 1924, the Caliphate was abolished. With that decision, the last official institution of the Ottoman state disappeared into history. For 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire had ruled across 3 continents. It had seen nearly 60 sultans. It had conquered Istanbul. It had served the 2 holy cities of Mecca and Medina. It had reached the gates of Europe, and for centuries, it had remained one of the most influential powers in world politics. Now it belonged to history, yet no empire should be judged only by its wars. The legacy of the Ottoman Empire still lives on today across dozens of countries. In its bridges, its mosques, its caravanserais, its legal traditions, its charitable foundations, its cuisine, its music, and in the shared memory of millions of people. History is not only the story of those who won or those who lost. History is the shared memory of humanity. And the Ottoman Empire wrote one of its longest, most complex, and most influential chapters.